Hey moms, it's Nikimi. Welcome to the channel in space for single moms navigating motherhood. And as always, we do not bash the baby daddies because, well, we are here now. So I made a video titled Black Mothers, Are You Okay? Please go back and watch the video if you have not already. I take a deep dive into why I feel like every single mom, especially Black single mothers, should be in therapy. Okay. I also touched a little bit upon, the mindset that we've had when it comes to religion, and it's the pray it away mentality. Okay. And how I feel like that in some ways can be more harmful than it is helpful. And I want to preface this video by saying I am not here to bash the Black church, any leaders, okay? There's been a lot going on social media about if a dress is appropriate for a first lady or, this pastor's been allegedly messing around with this person. Listen, that's not my ministry, honey, okay? I do not have a heaven or hell to put anyone in. That's not why we are here. Okay. But I do want to talk to my single moms about church experience and what I feel like we really need to look out for and what we really need to, the things that I feel like we should change, right? So when we think about the history of the Black American church, which was founded, I believe, in the late 1700s, don't quote me on that, our church has always been a place of spiritual refuge, right? But then at one point, it was also a place where political activism was very heavy. That's where a lot of insurrections were born, is at the church. When something happened to one of us, it impacted all of us. We were a community, right? And you cannot mention the Black community without the church. They go hand in hand. They're interwoven, right? But things have changed. And I can remember being in my early 20s when I had my daughter, and I was always here, I had lost my mom by then, but just my other elders that may have been around that kind of interceded were like, y'all need to go to church and find y'all a good man. That's, you want to find you a good man, you go to church, and that cannot be further from the truth. But we're not going to go down that rabbit hole either of whether or not the men in the church are authentic or not, right? The point I want to make today is, and what I wish that I would have done differently, is when you go to church, do not go to get a man. Like, that should never be on your agenda. It should not be anywhere near your purview, is getting a man at church. Yes, it is ideal, right? It seems like the safest place that you would think to date is in the church, in the house of the Lord. But I'm going to tell you why that has been dangerous, right? When you are going to church or when you are looking for a church home, you should be focused on your spiritual journey. You want to be spiritually fed, right? And now that you are a mommy and you're a single mommy, you're not only looking at how you're going to be spiritually fed, but how are your children going to be spiritually fed, as they continue to grow on their little spiritual journey, right? So, the church, again, as I stated, used to be community. And we live in a society now where racism, patriarchy, and classism has been some contributing factors to the downfall of this country, right? But one that's not often talked about enough is individualism, right? Because the truth of the matter is there has not been, nor will there ever be, enough resources or jobs that pay well so that every family can live like George and Wheezy on the 50th floor, right? It's just not designed that way, right? I mean, you got to have the poor, because who's going to keep the rich rich? Everybody can't be a CEO or a boss, because then who's going to be the workers, right? And when you're looking at the church and you're looking at single parent homes, right? And you look at our Black men, at one point, the church used to be packed with our Black men, with their wives, with their children in tow, putting on their Sunday's best. There was at one point where our black men leaned heavily into their faith. And somewhere along the line, they've just been slowly not coming, slowly falling off of the church roster. You know, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get here? Because when we speak about the Bible and we say that men are supposed to be, the husbands are supposed to be the head of the household, right? The women are to be submissive because they are the weaker vessel, right? But our men have had so many challenges with just being able to thrive here in America. And I'm talking about, you don't see black-owned corporations, you know. And I've said it before, there are not enough of us in any positions, powerful positions, with enough clout to make any type of change for our community, right? I mean, it's just a fact. You know, and contrary to popular belief, you know, before the crack cocaine epidemic, you know, projects, welfare, and a litany of other things that we say has been the leviathan of, you know, why black families fell apart. You know, before that, our men were beating the pavement looking for work. They were prideful men, you know. But with lack of education, experience, and because they were black, right, they were still facing systemic racism, systemic oppression, right? What didn't work quite out in a lot of their favor. You know, early 1900s, like after slavery was abolished, you guys have to think, like, a lot of our black men and women had to work the lower paying jobs, the jobs that were servitude jobs, like servant jobs, housekeeping, you know, gardening, things like that. You know, it was still, they were in service, right? We know that when slavery ended, we just didn't magically become welcomed to America and seen as equal citizens, right? Even after civil rights, when, you know, segregation was ended, we didn't just magically be welcomed to white spaces. We were still already behind. There was already a gap with generational wealth, right? So I always talk about mental health with black women. Well, how do you think that really impacted, you know, generations of men ago? A lot of them just gave up, right? They drowned it out their sorrows, you know, hanging out at the bottom of a bottle. Not all, but many. And then, of course, the drugs came, you know. Yep, sure did. So a lot of men stopped going to church. They stopped believing. Right? You think about it, like when you're at church, if you've ever attended church, especially a black church, you're in there, you're singing the hymns, you know, they've got the choir going and, you know, powerful voices are singing and the preacher is spreading the word and you're feeling all hopeful and jumping up and down, you know, but then when you go home a couple of days later, you're back sometimes feeling the way you felt the week before. You're sitting in your situation. Perhaps you're facing eviction or foreclosure on your home or car repossession, or maybe you just got laid off from your job. You start to worry, right? Yep. So a lot of people, I was listening to this lady on TikTok about a year and a half ago. And she was really, now I don't share these sentiments, but it's always good to just listen to other people. She was basically saying she was decentering Christ. You know, she grew up in the black church. When she became older, you know, after seeing, you know, her elders praying in the church and, you know, examples were provided before her, she grew up, she got on fire for the Lord, you know, she was asking, you know, God to heal her and, you know, he didn't. And, you know, she got to really reading the word and it just hit her that she felt like, you know, things that were in the Bible were not of God. And she said, when she got older, she looked back and she realized, she went to visit her old neighborhood, and she said that, those women and men were praying, but nothing in their lives changed. Their lives were not getting any better. The community actually declined, And so, although I don't share those sentiments, that happens to people more often than not. People give up. So, I would implore, you to get in a church where you can be active. When George Floyd, the whole situation with police brutality hit, that had a lot of us in our feelings. The internet was in shambles. People's true colors started coming out too, didn't it? Yep, sure did. But then I often wondered why, when you would see a couple of clips that went viral of leaders kind of speaking on the topic a little bit, I'm sure there were a couple of Black police officers that attended the church. How come, we didn't see Black police officers or those that are in law enforcement press upon the young boys the importance of, or the benefits of becoming a police officer or joining law enforcement, right? Police your own community. Because let's pray and give tithes and let's build a new church, and we're trying to do things out in the community and, and get like, excuse me, And I've said it before, I'm not vehemently against God blessing us. For sure, he will bless you with a nice home for you and your family. Of course, you can have you a new car. God doesn't want us to be able to enjoy some things of this world, right? But most importantly, God gave us the resources that we need here on earth, and he gave us each other. That's why he gave us all different gifts. And not so that you can selfishly hold for yourself, but that you may share for others. We're all connected, right? Community. So when you're looking for a church, your primary focus, secondary focus, or even tertiary focus should never be to find a man. You have to sharpen your discernment, babes. Yep. You need your faith. And you need to be a part of something that's greater than yourself. You need a church that's going to pour into your young Black son or your young Black daughter. For sure. Yep. Yep. And a lot of the way that we dress in church has changed too. I'm not judging. I don't really care. It's not bothering me how you come dressed, but I'm just saying, it screams I'm looking for a man, and I'm not really here for my soul's salvation. And I think that that's something that we have to change. Not every occasion there's a place and a time to wear things. I went to church, a multicultural church last year for Easter, and this lady had on this satin looking dress, and it was pretty form fitting, and the back was cut out. It was a low cut back. It was a low cut dress in the back, and it fell right above her butt. So she had on no bra. She didn't even have a coat on or anything. And I'm like, people see that you have on no bra. What are we doing? I didn't understand it. Again, I'm not judging. I'm not like, oh, she's going to go to hell. That's not me, but it made me think like, wow, we really have changed, Yep. And we've got to come out of that as women all up, but especially as a single mother, because people will prey upon you already. It's already hard to date because either, you're faced with men don't really, aren't really ready to step up and be, the bonus dad or whatever, right? Or they're going to take advantage of you because they feel that you're desperate and you're vulnerable because of your quote unquote situation. Yep. You got to sharpen up your discernment, babe. Sure do. Yep. Yeah, you got to sharpen your discernment. So I would implore you guys, find you a church that is, that's spiritually feeding you and increase your discernment, because when people are praying over you and laying their hands on you, you need to really make sure that their intentions are pure and that they're not battling something, Make sure that they're praying for you and not praying on you. Okay. That's very important place for you and your kids to grow and be fed spiritually. Mentally is good for your nervous system. And it's just a place for, you guys to come and lay your burdens down. You look forward to going, to worship with your family, with your church family. Yeah. But that's my think piece on that, guys. To my single mommies. You got this, mamas. I love you guys. Till next time. Bye.